A warm welcome to all participants this evening in what is the first speaking event in 2021 of the ACT chapter of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, entitled Implications of the Biden Administration for Australia and the Indo-Pacific. My name's Phil Dyack and I am an ACT chapter AAAA counsellor. I'm very pleased to facilitate our event tonight, and it's a great opportunity to hear from one of our leading foreign policy analysts, Dr. John Lee, who I'll introduce to you very shortly. Dr. Lee is an adjunct professor and non-resident senior fellow at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and at the Hudson Institute in Washington, DC. He's also held an adjunct professorship at the Australian National University. From 2016 to 18, he was a senior advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. In this role, he served as the principal advisor on Asia and for economic, strategic and political affairs in the Indo-Pacific region, and was also lead advisor on the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper of the Australian Government. John's been widely published in leading policy and academic journals, and also in the media in the US, Asia and Australia, and indeed as recent as in the Australian yesterday, with a piece providing a broad analysis now that President Biden has taken office. Currently based in Sydney, Dr. Lee received his Master's and Doctorate in International Relations from the University of Oxford and earlier degrees from the University of New South Wales. Before I do pass to John, some brief housekeeping matters for this evening. The event will run until 7 p.m, with the time split evenly between John's talk, about 25 minutes, with the remainder of the time of a half an hour for tonight's audience having the opportunity to put questions to him. I encourage you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A facility at any time from now on your Zoom page, and I will relay your questions to John during the Q&A segment. I'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible in the time available. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome John, and pass to him.
Thank you, Phil, and I'm really delighted to be the first speaker for the Institute this year, and thank you all for joining on virtually. Now, we have seen the most divisive election in living memory in the United States, and the political ramifications of it are still playing out as we speak. It did often seem like Donald Trump and Joe Biden were from a different, not just a different political universe, but a different moral universe. And that often signals radical changes in policy when there is a change of president. But I don't think that is so in foreign policy terms. Even during the campaign, Biden promised to do things very differently to Trump in terms of foreign policy in the region, and especially when it relates to China. Biden did not promise to do things very differently to Trump. He did not oppose the objectives of Donald Trump. In particular, he had very little argument about accepting that the United States is engaged in a comprehensive competition and rivalry with China. There was no argument that putting blood and treasure towards advancing a so-called free and open Indo-Pacific, which is essentially strengthen the liberal order. There was no dispute there from Joe Biden. And there was no dispute about the need to reset and reframe the economic relationship with China. All Biden really promised to do was to do all of these things better than Donald Trump had done. This means better relationships with allies and partners, in Biden's view, reasserting American presence and influence in institutions and multilateral forums, reasserting American moral leadership, for example, on issues such as democracy and climate change, and junking the divisive America First rhetoric of the Trump era. Now, I know not everything about American policy or even regional policy is about China, but I focus on China because China policy really is the most acute litmus test of a new administration's mindset as far as we're concerned, and it obviously has the most impact on Australia. As Phil mentioned, I published an op-ed in the Australian newspaper yesterday saying that Biden seems determined to learn from the mistakes of not just the Trump administration, but from the time when Barack Obama was in power. Now, I was in the Australian government for the last year of the Obama era and was a close observer of the Obama years before that from the outside. So, from the inside and observing from the outside, Obama was cautious and unprepared to act decisively. He had a distaste for the brutal reality of international competition and rivalry, which was intensifying. And as a result, he was, in many instances, increasingly outmaneuvered by countries such as China and Russia. Now, even though Biden has only been in the White House for several weeks, he has very clearly gone out of his way to signal that a very different mindset is in place from when he was vice president. For example, he has left in place the Trump era tariffs against China and many of the other presidential executive orders putting restrictions on various interactions, economic interactions and investments with China. It is clear that Biden wants to preserve as much leverage as possible that was gained during the Trump period. Now, Tony Blinken, his appointed Secretary of State, has openly agreed with the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that what is occurring in Xinjiang amounts to genocide, a highly significant position, as those of you who watch China will know. The United States Navy has sent a guided missile destroyer just in the last weeks through the Taiwan Straits. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has weighed strongly into the discussion about Chinese economic coercion of Australia and other countries and about what is happening in Hong Kong. He didn't need to do that. Without prompting, cabinet members in the Biden team have reaffirmed that the US will meet its obligations regarding defending Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, all without prompting. If you remember the Obama period, these promises of meeting these defense obligations took some time to come, and even then it wasn't stated as categorically as Biden has done in the first 2 weeks. Now, this in my mind is all to send a signal that the lack of resolve, which occurred during the Obama years, does not apply to the Biden administration. And that lack of resolve, I think, as Biden and his team would privately and in some instances publicly admit, was the missing ingredient from the Obama period. Now, all of this so far could be dismissed as shadowboxing, and there is a long way to go before we really know what the Biden administration will be like in foreign policy terms. However, there is a saying, and I think it's quite true, that personnel, especially at the early stages of an administration, personnel equals policy. And if we look at the main people that Biden has nominated, the US is really deadly serious about this comprehensive competition and rivalry with China. In every key position, Biden has chosen to appoint individuals who believe in the need for the US to compete with China rather than adopt a more accommodationist stance. So I'm referring to Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor. Many expected Michelle Flournoy, Secretary of Defense, who was of the same mindset, but instead Lloyd Austin has been chosen. Now, we don't know a lot about Lloyd Austin, but even so, Austin's primary advisor on the region and China will be Eli Ratner, who was Biden's Deputy National Security Advisor when Biden was Vice President. Eli is one of the most forward-leaning people on China in the Washington establishment. For Australia, one of the most significant appointments is Kurt Campbell, who was, of course, Hillary Clinton's Assistant Secretary for East Asia. Now, Campbell is known as a very hard-headed person on China. He has a very good understanding of Southeast Asia, which is quite rare in American circles. Now, there was some concern in Australian circles that Campbell would be too eager to defend the Obama period. However, if you look at the public articles he had authored over the past 2 years, they demonstrate that he has moved with the times. and he is significantly harder on China than he was during the Obama years. For example, he authored an article with Jake Sullivan in The Atlantic, I believe, and another with Eli Ratner in Foreign Affairs in 2019, which argued that the United States needed to have the better leverage and achieve a favorable competitive existence with China in all fields: military, economic, technological, and normative. Now, this could well have been the Trump administration talking. While Campbell does not criticize the Obama administration in public or in private, he does seek to frame what he accepts are previous failures as an intergenerational one, meaning Obama shares the blame with Bush, Clinton, and Bush. He also has very good and long-standing personal relationships with politicians and senior officials from the entire region. Now, from the Australian side, Campbell is well known to all our senior officials personally and professionally, and our access to him personally is already excellent. The other aspect of the appointment of Kurt Campbell, which is significant, is the structure of the National Security Council, which has Kurt as the czar, if you like, of the Indo-Pacific, which includes China and Russia, but with a broader mandate to coordinate the entire administration's Indo-Pacific policies between agencies. The fact that this is an Indo-Pacific czar is highly relevant. I see this as an attempt to replicate, broaden, and institutionalize the de facto role that Matt Pottinger within the Trump administration had in applying a hard-headed but liberal internationalist and alliance-based framework when dealing with China. Matt Pottinger, for those of you who don't know, he was a Deputy National Security Advisor for Donald Trump and really the architect of many of Trump's policies towards China. Campbell also has the enormous responsibility of integrating the democracy agenda with the strategic agenda. Beyond the headline or the top-level appointees, I can tell you that the next 3 to 4 levels of appointees or officials are flooded with individuals from the DC think tank world who have spent the last few years of their careers coming up with ways of countering, balancing against, or deterring Chinese actions and policies. Many of these officials, through my Hudson Institute affiliation, I've worked with on these sorts of issues. Importantly, we are looking at strategic experts flooding Treasury and commerce agencies and financial and economic experts entering the State Department and the defense entities. Their role is to come up with an expanded and better integrated set of tools to compete, outmaneuver, and even impose costs or punishments on China. So, give you one example, take someone like Dalip Singh, who will be appointed as Deputy National Security Advisor and the Deputy National Economic Council Director to the President. It is an indication of how enduring the Trump agenda really is, even if the Biden administration would never openly admit that. Singh is from the New York Federal Reserve and is expected to have a very influential role in determining external economic, trade, and technology policy to achieve better outcomes for Americans. Now, essentially, this is a more polite way of continuing the Trump era policies of adjusting American economic policy and engagement with the rest of the world and China in particular, not only to weaponize economic tools and deploy economic statecraft in a far more strident way, but to achieve a better outcome for the domestic US economy from international trade and investment. Now, part of my job is to remain extensively engaged with any administration in Washington, regardless of whether the Democrats or Republicans. And I have interacted and even worked with many appointees at all levels that are now in power. There is a language involving deterrence and cost imposition against China that was not there even a few years ago. Let me now shift to some inside the Beltway Australian reactions of my perception of it. First, the national security community. For countries who have moved towards a very active countering mindset, the Trump administration's combativeness was strangely appreciated in some ways, especially coming after the Obama years, where confrontation or avoiding confrontation with China often left Australia in front and alone on issues such as the South China Sea. From 2017 onwards, Australia moved to a much more concerted countering or balancing approach with respect to China, away from a hedging or small target approach, and this was certainly encouraged and supported by the Trump administration. The Australian national security community appreciates that Biden has moved away from an Obama-era managerial style of relations with China towards a more strategic and competitive one. But I would say that many in the Australian national security community are still very closely watching Biden's temperament and tolerance for risk and disruption, as these are very early days and there has not yet been any real costs endured by the administration on the stances that they have taken that I mentioned earlier. Without the willingness of the president and White House to take risks and disrupt rivals or disrupt negative trends, we were aware that the situation will deteriorate over time. I can tell you, having been inside government, that the lack of capacity or willingness to confront China in this context by the United States was what most sapped the courage and even strategic creativity of allies during the second-term Obama administration. For the national security community, there might be an immediate spike in American soft power, or at least an increase in the likability of America under Joe Biden. But that is all transient in many respects, and hard power is often more impactful than soft power for the national security community. That hard power will further diminish if Biden reduces spending on defence, which may occur. For the Australian diplomatic community, my view is that senior Australian political leaders actually enjoyed privileged and often exclusive access to the American counterparts under Trump, because Australia never overtly shunned or criticised the Trump White House, as many other countries did, and we were seen as pulling our weight by the Trump administration, unlike the Trump view or some allies in Asia and in Europe. However, under Trump, the hollowing out of the relevance of the State Department, which occurred almost immediately, was quite distressing for the relevant Australian departments, particularly Foreign Affairs and Trade, because it meant that the normal working relationship of allied cooperation could not occur at the deep institutional level that it needs. And there was always a very tenuous over-reliance on senior interaction to get things done. In this sense, many in the Australian diplomatic community are looking forward to meaningful business as usual interaction between officials at the middle and lower levels under Biden. Additionally, the Australian diplomatic community was always anxious about the US being missing in action in a diplomatic sense in the region, especially with respect to regional meetings and institutions. This forced Japan and Australia to carry much of the weight over the past 4 years, and we did that, but it really needs the United States to be present. There is quite excitement that Biden has chosen a very Asia-literate group of senior officials who will understand the importance of an internationalist America re-engaging at that diplomatic level, and not just through the prism of hard national security and defense. Nevertheless, there is still a recognition that the United States needs to compete through and within institutions, and that mere engagement and involvement in them is not sufficient. For example, the Trump administration was belatedly preparing to launch an institutional offensive to fill global institutions with American officials or those from like-minded countries. I think Biden will do the same and will actually do a better job in this context than the Trump administration would have done. The Trump administration was also going to begin challenging Chinese attempts to change definition of human rights in particularly United Nations bodies and force institutions to focus increasingly on the Chinese treatment of Uyghurs and other human rights abusers. The Trump administration was also going to re-engage with international institutions on intellectual property and patents to put pressure on China on both with respect to Chinese practices in these areas and Beijing's attempts to redefine what IP theft means. Once again, Biden has carried on that agenda, and I think he will actually do a better job than the Trump administration in that regard. So in this sense, I think within the Australian government setup, it's broadly positive, but there are some mixed feelings about Biden's promise to refocus on institutions. On the one hand, the diplomatic community in Australia wants America to re-engage with existing institutions, but on the other, US re-engagement without contesting will offer legitimacy to Chinese attempts to change control of these institutions. And once again, this comes back to the extent to which Biden is prepared to confront and compete with China and bear the disruption and potential cost of doing so in the longer term. The diplomatic community in Australia will have mixed feelings about Biden's promise to refocus on democracy and human rights. The national security community supports this because it is another potential way to put some pressure, legitimate pressure on China and delegitimize many of China's actions. However, the diplomatic community is wary of weaponizing democracy because, of course, many of our partners in the region are not democracies or imperfect democracies. Now, the economic and business communities in Australia, many Treasury officials had been concerned about the long-term prospects of the US dollar under Trump, and constant and significant falls in the US dollar relative to the Australian dollar could have created real serious problems for us. On the other hand, other Treasury officials were supportive for Trump's monetary tax and other stimulus measures, which they believe would have left the US or were leaving the US in a stronger position in the longer term. They would accept that Biden's election offers some short-term relief and stability because the politics of a Biden administration is so much more predictable. But they fear that allegedly pro-welfare and expensive climate change and other policies will hamper American economic growth in the longer term. The point I make is that there is still much disagreement as to whether the Biden victory is a positive or negative thing for the US and business and Australian business communities. With respect to the business community, those firms with substantial interest in the US, I think, would have actually preferred a Trump victory. On the other hand, those firms exporting to China are hopeful that what they hope would be a softer Biden approach towards China will lead to a softer Australian approach towards China. I don't think that will occur, but that is the hope within some in the business community. If there is a softer approach towards China, that in turn will cause Beijing, they argue, to relax some of the economically coercive measures against Australian exporters. Once again, I don't actually think that would occur, and even a softer approach to China, I don't think necessarily would lead to the end of the coercive measures taken against Australia by China. On this business argument that a softer Biden approach would lead to a softer Australian approach, in any event, I think this argument is shaky, if not just wrong, on several accounts. First, Biden's rhetoric against China might soften, but many of his policies just simply won't, and we're already seeing that. Two, Australia's tough policies against China was not forced upon it by the Trump administration, but were taken on its own merits, even if Canberra appreciated the cover that the Trump administration offered. And three, it is not clear what a softer Australian approach would actually mean. as if you look through, for example, the 14 grievances which the Chinese embassy has issued, it's not clear that Canberra could really walk back on any of those issues, such as Huawei, the South China Sea, or foreign interference. Finally, on environmental issues relevant to Australia, Australia's emerging position that I can see is that it is committed to lowering carbon emissions, perhaps even to a net zero target by 2050, but it will do so with an agnostic view of the energy mix. That is, it will be a combination of using fossil fuels more efficiently as well as renewable technologies. Now, there are some concerns that the Biden administration will push other nations, either bilaterally or through a multinational agreement, to agree to a renewable target to combat climate change. And I know much has been made of the possible tension between the two countries on this, but actually I'm not too sure that the positions of the Morrison government and the Biden administration are really that different. I don't think the US is keen to push other countries to commit to a specific renewable target. My sense is that the Morrison government will compromise on some of the symbolism in terms of allowing combating climate change to return as a top order issue, and will eventually commit to a net zero target in some form, while Biden will compromise on some of his stated policies against fracking and ambitious targets to lower the use of fossil fuels. In short, I think the compromises by both sides will actually lead to both countries being fairly close together on where they're going with climate. The rhetoric and optics might be very different, but I think the substance won't be that dissimilar. Now, because of time constraints, I haven't spoken about a lot of things: Southeast Asia, Taiwan, the Quad, just to mention three. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions on these or other issues to the best that I can in the time remaining. So thank you. And Phil, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, John, for that very succinct and wide-ranging discussion. And yes, I'm sure that some people may wish to ask questions in those spaces over the next half an hour or so that we have. First question that I can see is from an Akosi Lessie, is what can a Biden administration do to counter the massive RCEP trade deal of last November?
There is a look. First of all, it's a good question, because I think the Biden administration acknowledges that even where they have agreed, the Trump administration, the huge missing piece was really the economic side of any sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. And I should note that while it was Trump who pulled out of the TPP, the Democrats had also committed to pulling out of the TPP. So on both sides, there's a bit of skepticism about that. I'll get to Rcep in a minute. What I would say is that there are early discussions now in the Biden administration about rethinking the TPP, or what is now the CPTPP. And certainly I think the Japanese have been quite eager to engage the Biden people about the possible United States joining the new TPP. There are some sort of technical difficulties with that, because, for example, would the United States have to renegotiate terms with every single country, those sorts of things. But that conversation is occurring. On the RCEP issue, I think the United States, the Biden people, and I noticed, because even prior to the election victory, some of his economic advisors, I did some work with them. They've looked very closely at Rcep, and they realized that Rcep, it is a meaningful agreement, but it is not a game-changing agreement. It largely formalizes a lot of the agreements, or the bilateral and minilateral agreements that have already been in place with ASEAN. It is potentially a more powerful platform from that, because it opens the way to harmonizing a lot of issues which would allow for a far higher quality agreement. But a point I'm making is that at this stage, the Americans don't see Rcep as a threat. It's certainly, the optics of Rcep is certainly very favourable to China, not favourable to the United States. But the United States or the Biden administration is more interested in looking to see whether Rcep provides a platform for a more meaningful Rcep Mark II agreement. But right now, I wouldn't say that Rcep was something which they saw as an urgent agreement that they need to respond to in terms of competing for influence with China.
Thanks, John. And a question from a former Executive Director of the AIIA, Melissa Connolly-Tyler. Do you think there'll be any change of approach towards Taiwan under the Biden administration? And will the Trump administration's moves in its final days force an early focus on this issue?
Rather than a change in approach towards Taiwan, I actually think the Biden administration is almost going to double down on the Trump strategic approach without unnecessary provocative political statements that often came out of the Trump administration about Taiwan. So at this early stage, it's been 2 weeks since Biden has become president. The senior Taiwanese official was invited, I believe, to the inauguration. I mean, that itself sends a signal. Yes, there wasn't a phone call, as far as I know, between Biden and the Taiwanese president like there was with Trump when Trump won. But if you look at the military and strategic maneuverings in Taiwan Straits, the Biden administration is as tough or as determined as the Trump administration. Finally, I would say that in terms of the Taiwan issue for the Americans, this is actually more a structural or strategic issue rather than a political one, in the sense that given all that's going on in our region, the importance of Taiwan as both a piece of strategic geography and also as an advanced economy with plugged very deeply into critical and technological supply chains, for example, in computer chips. The importance of Taiwan, or the importance to the Americans of defending Taiwan against any takeover, has actually increased in the last 5 years or so. So I don't think this is actually a political issue. I think on both sides, to put it very bluntly, the American willingness to sacrifice blood and treasure to defend Taiwan has actually increased over the past 5 years for those structural strategic reasons.
Yes, just on phone calls, a question from me. It was reported that President Biden's phone call with Prime Minister Modi, I think in the last 24 hours, was his 10th, and a joint statement, the leaders agreed to continue a close cooperation and support on freedom of navigation, territorial integrity, stronger regional architecture, and so on. But as yet, no phone call to President Xi. Would you chance your arm, and what sort of could sit behind all of this at this stage?
Oh, I'm almost certain I know what sits behind it, and that is that it is giving a clear signal to both allies and partners and to the Chinese of where the Biden administration wants to go. As you mentioned, it's highly significant that not only did Biden speak to his traditional allies, Canada, Australia, Japan, etc., but and those in Europe, but he spoke to the leader of India, which is obviously the 4th member of the Quad. Now, the Quad has been a real bugbear between China and the Quad members. And the fact that Biden spoke to Modi and essentially both agreed to release a joint statement reaffirming the rationale for reinstitution of the Quad, which is largely to counter China, it's unintentionally not particularly subtle. Now, in terms of not speaking to the Chinese, I think there's both a optical and a strategic reason for that. The optical reason is that Biden is telling the world that is serious about re-engaging allies and partners first before competitors and potential rivals. The strategic reason is that China is particularly good at exploiting any differences between the United States and other countries. So Biden has made a concerted attempt to make sure he's on the same page with key allies and partners before speaking to the Chinese.
Great. And a little closer to home, should US-China commercial relationships under Biden progress, the Grand Compact idea, the effect that commodity tariffs, for example, might continue or disadvantage Australian exports?
I don't actually think there will be a grand compact. Um, I I think the not just the not just a political relationship but a strategic relationship, but the economic relationship between the two countries. From the American side, it's not just the Biden side, but from I think it's there's quite a bit of consensus here. Uh, uh, to put it very bluntly, from the American side, they think that they've been screwed by the Chinese structurally over a long period of time. A lot of it's the Americans' fault, but certainly that's now the American perception of it. So there is now a concerted attempt to reset and reframe the relationship. Now that may not mean a lowering of tariffs. I'm not quite sure, but Biden has promised to not end. Biden has not said that he will end the economic confrontation with China. Or what he has said is that he will be far more clinical. His words were he will use a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Now, as things progress with China, when there's two large economies dealing with these sorts of issues, one may want to use a scalpel, but effectively one is forced to use a sledgehammer. So I once again, I don't think the rhetoric during the Trump years will survive, and I think that's actually to America's benefit that it doesn't. But I don't actually think a lot of the economic mindsets will change. And I mentioned um, the officials being appointed in Treasury, in Commerce, in Defence, in State, in NSC, 2 or 3 or 4 levels beneath the top. Their 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 expertise is about economic statecraft. There's a lot of people there who are having conversations about economic deterrence, economic statecraft, and cost imposition. I think I don't think I think that aspect of the Trump period will actually survive, even if the optics seem more soothing than it would otherwise be.
Thanks, John. That question was from the ACT AIIA President Heath McMichael. Another question from our chapter from Natalie Mabini. Can you say anything about the US relationship with Iran, the prospects of a new agreement being negotiated, and will there be implications for Australia's relationship with Iran and others in the Middle East?
Iran's an interesting one because one of the first things Trump did, and quite publicly, as we all know, was to walk away from the agreement with Iran. And interestingly, one of the key negotiators of that agreement was Jake Sullivan under Obama, who is now the National Security Advisor. So there's a bit of history there. Now, Jake and other members of the administration have been on record in saying that they want to come back to an agreement with Iran. But quite cleverly, I think they've recognized that they can't get back to the same agreement just because Iran is now in a different place to what it was when they first signed that agreement, in the sense that the activities of Iran have been far more extensive in the region than it was prior. I think what will happen is that the administration will make a priority to come to an agreement because politically they want to get to one, but they will insist on conditions that were previously not in the original Iran deal. So, for example, I would expect them to be far tougher on the timelines by which the Iranians are allowed to return to the nuclear game compared to previous agreement. I would expect that there will be a lot more tripwires put in, i.e. if Iran is perceived to be violating certain obligations, automatic tripwires will come in, which will allow the US to come in again with sanctions and so on. So I think they'll want an agreement because there's a political imperative for the administration to get one. But I think it will actually be a tougher agreement than it was before on Iran.
Thanks, John. We're panning around the globe pretty quickly here. Another question from Penelope Wensley. What concrete steps do you think a Biden administration will be prepared to take and when to address what's happening in Hong Kong?
Look, it's Hong Kong is difficult, if not intractable one, because the reality is that no one disputes that Hong Kong belongs to China, and that China has a legal right, in a sense, beyond its treaty obligations, to impose its will on Hong Kong. So yes, the argument will be made, as it was during the Trump administration, that the Chinese are breaking their treaty that they signed, but Hong Kong belongs to China and is accepted that China rules over Hong Kong, which is a very different situation to Taiwan. Look, I think the sanctions against Hong Kong individuals or those involved in the changing or dismantling of liberal institutions in Hong Kong, which were in place during the Trump era, will continue. But I think the significance of Hong Kong now is that the example of Hong Kong is being used to make the argument that Taiwan now is really the prize that cannot be lost. Or that's probably not the right way of putting it, but it is the issue that is now at hand because one country, two systems just doesn't work under Chinese Communist Party rule. So this is all a long roundabout way of saying that I don't actually think the Americans have a lot of good options in Hong Kong, and they're not prepared to prioritize the issue of Hong Kong when it comes to all sorts of wide-ranging, serious financial sanctions, because there'll be other issues between the US-China, which I think will warrant those sorts of sanctions.
Thanks. And an early question, actually, from John Tillerman. This is around nuclear doctrine. And he asks whether you expect the Biden administration to change its basic doctrine, anything around no first use posture, and how might this impact Australia's dependence on and under the US nuclear umbrella?
I wouldn't expect there to be any change to the no first use doctrine. And I do think that there will be a assessment of military posture by the United States in the region, which will include the tactical strategic placement of nuclear weapons. But I think the greater or the more impactful conversation in a military sense going on is more about land-based conventional missiles. I think the US is very keen to develop land-based conventional missiles and place them in areas that will disincentivize China to expand its military footprint, including in the South China Sea. And I actually think that that conversation is something which is more pertinent to Australia in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, John. Again, I guess focusing on the Indo-Pacific and Asia, Hayley Channer from the Perth US Asia Centre asks, what do you think the key thing is the US can do to convince Australians and other allies that it's committed to the security of the Indo-Pacific over the long term?
I mean, I think there are two basic elements. There is presence or resources, and there's resolve or demonstration of resolve. I I was quite critical of the Obama period, and I was critical because even though on policy terms, in substantial terms, I actually thought Barack Obama had great policies in the Indo-Pacific, and there were high hopes the pivot to Asia would be a helpful strategic development for allies in countering some aspects of China's behavior. But the reality was that it wasn't. And it wasn't so much about resourcing, it was that there was never the credible belief that the Obama administration would actually take risk in countering China. So that resolve element, as I mentioned at the beginning of my prepared remarks, Joe Biden seems very determined um, to address, right? And it's only been 2 weeks, but he's certainly gone out of his way to show that the resolve under his administration is very different to certainly under the last Democratic administration. On the capability aspect, look, I mean, there's always there's always going to be concern about shrinking or relatively shrinking defense budgets, and like any other Western nation, the United States can't spend all of its treasure on defense. I think what the region will look for is a couple of things. One, the amount of resources they're actually putting to developing new or existing technologies that are specifically designed to counter China. Here I'm talking about things like land-based missiles, unmanned vehicles, swarm vehicles, maritime awareness type capabilities, those things that you're essentially developing to counter China. One, the amount of resources put towards that, and two, the military posture, where those resources are actually based, because that actually tells you the preparedness of the United States to actually deploy those resources to change Chinese behavior.
Mm. And John, following on a little on the China theme, which is never too far away, Vanessa Wren asks how hard the Biden administration will work with Europe to put together, I guess, and develop and implement its policy on China.
Well, judging by the degree of annoyance and anger of the Biden administration when Europe signed that trade agreement with China without consulting the US, I would say that the Biden administration will put quite a bit of emphasis on Europe. And the reason why they'll do so, it's not just for the sake of gathering a large coalition against the Chinese. They realize that for the Chinese to achieve their technological ambitions, for example, the Made in China 2025 blueprint, for China um, to actually have a viable Belt and Road initiative, or a commercially viable Belt and Road initiative, for China to acquire some key military and civilian technologies or dual-use technologies, the source of leakage comes from Europe, largely. When it comes to the Belt and Road, if you analyze it, it doesn't work without Europe being a part of it, because Europe is the essential end consumer market for a lot of the Belt and Road blueprints. Likewise, Made in China 2025, it needs European expertise to get as well as American expertise. So for those reasons, I would expect the Biden administration to put enormous emphasis on Europe. Now, speaking bluntly, uh, when it comes to Europe, you have countries like Germany and Italy who are seen to be um, who are perceived by the Americans to not take the potential challenge of China particularly seriously. And then there are countries like France, for example, and UK is no longer in Europe, but UK who are gradually realizing that there are issues about China which may actually impact your own interests. So to answer the question, I would expect, of course, the Biden administration will try to engage Europe as much as possible, but I think they will focus on countries such as France and a post-Merkel Germany in order to effectively get the Europeans on side. Now, in military terms, for Europe, Russia is still the main problem. not China.
Yeah.
In fact, China is not really seen as a military problem to Europe. So that Russia piece is a separate issue, and that's more about the re-engagement of NATO that will occur under Biden.
Yes, I believe there's been significant Chinese investment in Italy too through Belt and Road. Yeah. Yes. We just more. I think it was this also came from Heath McMichael. The reception of the Biden administration, more broadly, perhaps the uh, the atmospherics change in Southeast Asia. Do you have any comment about that? And are there any pitfalls for Australia in that space?
First, with Southeast Asia, the general wisdom is that Southeast Asia will welcome the Biden administration because, of course, the Trump administration was difficult to deal with, and many countries just didn't deal particularly well with Trump administration and vice versa. I think that's true, but I think digging deeper than that, though, the fact that the Trump administration focused so much on Northeast Asia and the the uh, the anchors such as Australia, Japan, and even India. Southeast Asians, as we know, are world famous hedgers. They don't like to make decisions that will get them on the wrong side of great powers. They don't like to make decisions that cannot be that are irrevocable. They don't like to choose, essentially, or overtly choose. Under Trump, they could do that because Trump didn't have his focus on Southeast Asia, and they could sort of just exist beneath the radar. Yes, they were criticized occasionally for not taking tougher positions, but really there was no real consequence on these nations for not um, taking any more decisive actions, particularly when it comes to China. Uh, this is where it potentially is worrying for the Southeast Asian nations because, as I mentioned, the Obama administration is filled with senior and middle level people who understand the importance, strategic importance of Southeast Asia. And they are already talking about activating their relationships with Southeast Asia to achieve common strategic aims. That means Southeast Asian countries will now face more pressure than they did under the Trump administration to make specific decisions that the Americans would want. So here I'm talking about, to give you some examples, um, on the technological space. Southeast Asians were often, under Trump, were often criticized for making certain technological decisions, such as their interactions with Huawei, but nothing really happened. Under Biden, I think there'll be a more concerted attempt at actually enlisting the Southeast Asians to make certain decisions. But the flip side of that is that there will be more expectations, demands made of the Southeast Asian countries. In terms of dangers for Australia, um, I wouldn't say this is really a danger. I think it's more that with the Biden administration seeking to refocus on Southeast Asia, um, because of natural limits in attention spans and resources, um, Australia under the Trump administration and Japan had an outsized role in shaping a lot of American foreign policy. Now suddenly that the ear of Washington has now been extended to a whole range of countries in Southeast Asia. So Singapore, for example, would be one of them. Philippines would be another. That's not really a problem for Australia, but I do think that from a diplomatic point of view, Australia will actually have to work harder in some ways under the Biden administration to get our views across.
Thanks, John. And also in our region, Artyom Garin asks if you could share any thoughts on how Biden can affect the South Pacific, particularly PNG.
PNG is a difficult one because you've got a poor country desperately in need of finance, infrastructure, investment, multiple jurisdictions within the country itself, multiple stakeholders. Um, Look, I think the Biden view, which is not so different from the Trump view, but I think the Biden view will be that we'll have to accept the reality of an increased Chinese economic footprint in Papua New Guinea. Um, we just need to work to ensure that that economic footprint or certain investments and certain actions taken by the Chinese do not um, do not impinge on the direct strategic interests of Australia and the United States. So, for example, that $39 billion city was never going to happen in PNG, but we do know that the Chinese want to invest in areas which can become strategic assets. So we can't stop all Chinese investment, but we would certainly want to prevent Chinese investments that do actually transition into strategic assets.
Thanks. And I guess we can't have a presentation and Q&A like this without mentioning coronavirus. Brendan asks that a question around the fact that the now departed Trump administration, or the former president himself, blamed China for the outbreak in his own inimitable language, and even claimed that it originated in a lab in Wuhan. We know that there's a WHO sort of led inquiry that's in China at the moment on foot. The administration in the US has had its, the former administration had its travails and threatened to withdraw its funding. Do you see any of this sort of playing into the broader topic tonight of Biden administration for Australia and the Indo-Pacific?
On the main impact, I think, of the coronavirus and you know, the whole Trump era rhetoric against China is that Americans, and including the Democratic Party and the American population, Americans don't disagree with Donald Trump. That, to put it in very parochial language, it was China's fault. I think what upset them about the Trump administration was that that's a different issue to managing the COVID response.
Yes.
Now, hopefully, the vaccines kick in and there is a beneficial health response to that in the United States. Assuming that that sentiment about China hasn't gone away, and the behavior of China around COVID and on other issues hasn't really improved China's image amongst Americans either. So I guess to answer that question, views of China were already hardening across all stakeholders in the United States. COVID, like it did with lots of other things, really gave that not just a kick along, but I think has changed things decisively. And if, that obviously is not going to augur well for future US-China relations. But I really see no evidence that there has been any by the American public or stakeholders of China over the past year.
Thanks, John. And this might be our last question. It's, I guess, it's looking at more your feel through your involvements in the States and so forth about the plays in Congress and what the sort of portents for the future are. Zara Kimpton asks that Biden's been issuing a lot of executive orders overturning some of the Trump's initiatives so far. Congress will become more important in the next few months for his agenda. Do you think that the President will have problems getting initiatives through the Senate where the filibuster can make this difficult, especially with the divisive atmosphere in Washington at present? And looking ahead, do you think that Trump will still be an important influence at the next midterm elections?
First question, I do think on domestic issues, well, first of all, I do think the Congress and the Senate in particular is only growing in influence compared to 5 or 6 years ago, where they didn't really seem to be shaping much of an agenda. I certainly do think the Senate in particular is more important now than it was before. I do think that there is far more division in domestic issues than there is in foreign policy issues within America. And if you look at a lot of the executive orders that Biden has annulled from the Trump era, most of them are domestic issues to do with social issues, economic issues that have socio-economic consequences, those sorts of things. Even, once again, personnel is policy, and even when you look at some of the appointments by Biden, even though in foreign policy he's appointed a lot of moderate hawks in a Hillary Clinton sort of mold, in domestic policy he's appointed a lot more people who would be considered from the left base of Democratic Party and would enrage the right base of the Republican Party. So even his domestic policy czar, if you like, Susan Rice, who was actually Obama's national security advisor, Susan has a broad mandate over domestic policy, but a lot of her social and economic stances, I think, would be supported by the Democratic left and strongly opposed by the Republican right. So that just tells me that that division of domestic policy will continue, and that actually potentially has implications for American power and American influence abroad. That has to be watched. Oh, sorry, the last question about whether Trump is a factor. I think he'll be less of a factor than he would have been had he played his cards more wisely and more sanely when he lost the election. If he had lost the election, complained a little bit, accused the system of having cheated him from another term, but left it at that, I think he would be an enormously powerful Republican figure. In fact, I think he would be the favorite to run again in 4 years. He will still have his base, but I sense that he won't go away, but I don't think he's as powerful a figure as he would have been otherwise.
Thanks very much, John. That's been a fantastic analysis for all of us. Really appreciated and valued your time tonight, and all the best for your future. And before we go, I think a slide will come up shortly that will advertise our next event, which is on Wednesday the 24th of February, 6 p.m. The Afghan peace processes, some diplomatic lessons, and that will feature William Maley. It'll be in person in Canberra as well as online. So look out for that one. Thank you all.